So I'm here today to talk about younger people's understanding of men's violence against women. This is work I did for my PhD, and I'm also currently doing the same area of work but with much younger children. So this is focusing on 11 and 12-year-olds, the study that I'm talking about today, but the current research I'm involved in is looking at 5, 6, 7 and 8-year-olds. But I don't have much to say on that just yet. I'll come back. So what do we mean by men's violence against women? Obviously you've all got an understanding of gender-based violence, but I think it's really important to clarify that it's not the result of random individual acts, but deeply rooted in structural inequality, so gender inequality. In Scotland, we have a gendered definition, so that's different from the definition used in England that is gender neutral. So in Scotland, we're looking at violence against women means the act of any violence by men that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women. So there's a recognition by the Scottish Government that disproportionately women are affected and disproportionately it's men that perpetrate this violence. It's quite important because it was grassroots groups, so women's organisations and charities that really strived to get this definition recognised by the Scottish Government. So it's quite feminist in its approach, and it's something that men and women both working in Scotland are very proud of, and it gives us a great framework to work within. So Scotland is the only country in the UK to recognise and facilitate a gender definition, thereby acknowledging the broader gender inequalities. So when I first started this work, Finn mentioned that I'd been working in women's refuges. So I'd started working in women's refuges as a volunteer when I was 17, 18, went on to work in women's aid refuges down here in London, first as a caseworker and then as a deputy manager. And I think the thing I used to love when the women came and you'd see the changes that they'd make and they'd move on with the kids and they'd make this new life for themselves. But you'd take them to this new flat, brilliant, and you'd come back and there was another lady with bin bags and her kids sitting on the refuge steps. So it was like a carousel of women that just kept coming. And some would come back and some would come for the first time, but there was always, the problem was always there, the issue of violence. And you just constantly felt that you were dealing with the consequences rather than the root causes. So when I saw the PhD advertised, I thought, well, this is an idea to look at preventive education, to focus upon that and to look at how we can prevent violence from happening in the first place. And this is obviously promoted more definitely now when we look at things like provision and protection. There is a real focus on primary prevention, so stopping the violence from happening in the first place. So the research that existed when I began this PhD tended to focus very much on those over the age of 15, 16, generally those seen as being old enough to be in a relationship of their own, to experience abuse or violence within a relationship themselves. And it was very much concentrated on the top end of secondary school. So I know a lot of you are interested in youth work, so obviously the later end of that. But I just thought there's all this research that is continuing to find that to bring up the same findings again and again, that boys say it's okay to rape a girl, girls say it's okay for him to treat me like this. So it was just this repetition and the same people saying it time and time again. So my focus was to look at those who were younger to look at primary school children, because at the time there was very little work done in primary schools. So the framework that I use for my research very much is feminist in terms of its conception, its underpinnings, its application, its use of methods, and its means of analysis. It's research that prioritises gender and women's experiences, and it promotes the empowerment of its participants, in this case the children and young people. And it also uses lived experience as a form of knowledge. There were a lot of people, when I wanted to approach primary schools, that said, kids don't know about stuff like that. Kids actually don't know anything. So it was a way of saying, well, they've lived for 10, 11 years, they've got this lived experience that they can draw upon, and that's what I wanted to talk to them about, how they understood and how they constructed violence and violence against women. And also the importance of being reflexive. So I know a lot of you work with childhood and looking at childhood as a social construction. And I also wanted to look at childhood as a temporal phenomenon rather than as a fixed state. So even though I picked a specific age of children, it was more so to get the access rather than a particular age or stage, because I knew that I'd be more likely to get access to children if I was looking at the top end of a junior school rather than the whole school. Interestingly, now I've done this work and I've got a bit of kudos behind me, now they're letting me back in to talk to anybody that I want, which is quite good. So I can look at it in that way. And I also wanted to look at how young people understood the present lived experiences, but also brought the past and the future into that. So it's not just one static point in their lives that we're looking at. They're looking at how they reflect on the past and how they look towards the future to formulate their ideas and their understandings. So the aims of the research, the first was to confront and challenge the everyday occurrence and acceptability of men's violence against women. Men's violence happens everywhere. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Every day, women are murdered, raped, tortured, burned, hit, strangled, mutilated, controlled, isolated, and harassed. Karen Ingalia Smith, I'm not sure if anyone's heard of her, but she set up a website called Counting Dead Women because she thought it was important to recognise the women that die each day at the hands of men. So she records their names. Currently, it's standing at 3.6 women a week. One woman is dead every 3.6 days by her calculations. So in the UK, sorry, yes. So in the past fortnight, Melissa Liddell, 23, was killed by her partner. Charmaine Spears, aged 41, was killed by her husband. Sarah Pollock, aged 41, was strangled and stabbed by a man known to her. Jill Goldsmith, aged 49, died of head injuries and her husband has since been charged. And Karen Buckley, one of our own students, was murdered after a night out in Glasgow last week. So it's to recognise that this is happening all the time. It's not an unknown phenomenon. We know it happens and it's everywhere. And I think it's really important to recognise that when we're looking at challenging the violence that does happen. The second aim was to challenge the perception that 11 and 12-year-olds are too young to know about violence or to offer opinions on it, which I came up against that attitude time and time again, mainly from councils and head teachers. Not parents, surprisingly. Parents were quite happy to let me talk to their children about anything their children wish to speak about. So one of the ways I did that was to find ways of talking to young people methodologically, and also through confronting these preconceptions that young people don't know about things. So the research questions I set out with are there. I'm going to let you read them while I have a drink. So the fieldwork took place in 5 primary schools. I approached 100 primary schools in Glasgow. We actually have over 160 primary schools in Glasgow, and got positive responses from 6. So there was a lot of resistance to the research initially. Some of the reasons were that children were too young to know about violence. Also, violence doesn't happen in some areas of Glasgow. I'm not sure if you knew that, but the leafy suburbs of Glasgow, no idea about domestic abuse. So it was quite interesting how head teachers framed this understanding and this resistance, thinking I should speak to them in secondary school because that's when they learn about it. The 6 primary schools, I used one as a pilot, the 5 others were really keen to take part, and it was a great cross-section of Glasgow. I was saying to Pam earlier, Glasgow's not as diverse as London, but it's more so than it ever used to be. But in terms of the schools, there were schools from the leafy suburbs, there were schools from quite socially deprived areas, there was also a Catholic, non-denominational schools, and also schools with high proportion of Asian children in there. So that's probably as good as you get in Glasgow in terms of a cross-section of kids. So the methods I used, I think all this being told by teachers, oh, they won't know anything about it, really frightened me. And initially, I wasn't sure how to kind of pitch the research or how to start talking about it. I wasn't sure the children would want to speak to me. So I devised an exploratory questionnaire. So this was used by researchers in Edinburgh when talking to young carers, and it's a way of finding out about their lives to then ask questions about them. So the exploratory questionnaire was 6 pages. They sat and did it in the classroom, so it asked things like the kind of things they were into, who the friends were, what they wanted to be when they grew up, who they lived with, what jobs they did at home, what they thought about certain things. Is it okay for a man to look after children? Is it okay for a woman to give up her job and look after children? So trying to kind of look at these gender norms initially and unpick some of them. And then I also asked questions about, is it ever okay to hit your friend? Is it ever okay to push your friend? Is it ever okay to tease your friend or call your friend names? And with each question, I also asked for a clarification. Why do you say that? So they could give an explanation rather than just taking it as a tick box exercise. The discussion group sessions, we did those in friendship groups. So they'd already identified who the friends were. We had maybe 4 or 5 children together. They were recorded, generally lasted an hour, which is quite a long time, more than I thought it would last, to be honest. So the discussion groups focused upon reflecting the answers that they'd given. So someone in a group said, it's okay for a man to hit a woman if, and then give the reason. Someone else in the group said, it's never okay for you to tease your friend because. So reflecting the answers back and then getting them to discuss it. And that worked really well. And it was good because it was their words that they'd used. So even though they weren't identified as so-and-so from this school said this, it worked really well in terms of gave them something concrete to talk around.
Sorry, was it answers from somebody in the group? Or was it answers
No, answers just from random. So it might have been an answer that they gave and they knew that they were going to be used in that way. but it was using their words, which I thought was quite important. From there, I devised 3 vignettes, which I'm going to... So these vignettes, for people that don't know, I'm sure you all probably do, is a story involving the third person. So a hypothetical situation that enables young people to talk, or anyone to talk around a situation. So these are the 3 that I used. I put them in this order because even though I didn't want to kind of graduate them in terms of emotional and more physical violence, when I started with maybe this one and then went back to this, the young people saw this one slightly differently. So I kind of put them in this order. So some of the responses, I'm going to use quite a lot of quotes and I'll talk about the findings. So if you can remember Claire and Lee, Lizzie and Dave, and Jamie and Jenny, because some young people might talk about those responses. Okay, is everyone finished? Have you? Sorry. Have you read them? All right. I'm really bad at judging how fast people read. Thank you. Okay, thanks. So the main findings of the research, there were 4 main findings really. I'm just going to list them here and then I want to talk about them in more detail. So the first finding was that young people subscribed to naturalised definitions of masculinity to explain rather than question why men are violent. So they'd see it as a natural way. That's what men do, that's what men are, that's what I'll do when I'm a man. So it was seen as a very linear and very distinct way of being a man. Young people defined real violence as physical acts done by men that had legal consequences. So the word real is really important here. As such, much of the violence experienced or perpetrated by themselves as young people was minimised, normalised and regarded as unreal. So real was something that happened to grown-ups. Young people justified men's violence against women using very rigid gender stereotypes and a rigid understanding of adult relationships framed by an understanding of heterosexuality and marriage. So because they institutionalised heterosexuality, they saw men as needing to behave in this way, and therefore the opposite, women behaved in this way. Then finally, young girls had ambition and felt presently that there were few restrictions to achieving their goals. They saw this as changing dramatically when they were married and they had children. That wasn't an issue for boys. Okay, so defining real violence. The way that young people defined violence followed a very prescribed model. So they talked about 2 or more men physically fighting in a public space. So the public space was where they were seen. They were seen by other people, and that was really important because they needed to be seen for the violence to be recognised. It usually was judged as taking place outside a pub or outside a bookies. So, and the violence, and this was really important, the violence would result in a physical injury. So an injury, something that could be seen. There was an intervention by authority. So generally when they talked about real violence, it was an ambulance coming, the police coming, somebody turning up and telling them that what was happening was wrong and that it should stop. And there was also a consequence. So the consequence, you were taken away in a police van and put in jail. So all of these things had to happen for violence to be considered real. And so this defining of real violence, very much looking at official terms. So we're looking at official recognition and who has this power of naming. So this is the official definition that young people judge to be, that's what real violence is. Because this existed, and in their world, but also exists in our world, feminists like Liz Kelly introduced this idea of naming. Women naming their own experiences for themselves. So something that might not be recognised officially was named by a woman because of her own experience as violence or as wrong. Okay, so that's the difference between defining and the naming of violence that I'm going to pick up on in a moment. So these are some of the pictures that young people drew. This was kind of introduced at the back of the exploratory questionnaire because I knew there'd be some kids that would finish in 5 minutes and there would be some that would take half an hour. Okay, so it was introduced initially as an exercise to keep everyone happy, including the teacher. There are definite issues between with analysing young people's drawings and making inferences from them with your own adult interpretations. But for me, it was more about getting them to draw pictures. So what they had to do here was to report a newspaper report on a violent incident. So you can see some of the things that they've talked about. So they're talking about pubs. There's lots of beheadings. There's lots of Old Firm, which in Glasgow is Celtic and Rangers. There's lots of shootings and stabbings. So quite dramatic images. I'm not taking anything from that. I use the slide because I think it's quite nice to look at drawings, but I also just put it there to show a demonstration of part of those methods. So you see it, violence outside, and you see it in the park, Neds fighting. You see it on the street. So a Ned is a young boy in a tracksuit, so a chav, a Scottish version of a chav. Like punching and kicking each other, real fighting. But then you know it's bad because the police will come. If they're fighting for real, they'll get arrested and they'll have to go to the court. So you can see how a lot of these are informing that very linear model of how they describe real violence. So naming unreal violence was behaviour that did not fit into this linear model in terms of the actors, in terms of the space, and in terms of the intervention. So unreal violence, when young people spoke about their experiences, signified the proximity of the young people to the violence in terms of it happened among them, their peers and their siblings. It happened in spatially close locations, such as school or the home or their communities, but not always between the same gender. Violence that was labelled unreal represented actions that the young people were more likely to normalise. So they called it dummy fighting, pretend, and unreal. So when the young people spoke about that, they did so in a way that would normalise, but when the girls talked about it, they were very affected by this kind of behaviour. So the unreal violence was more likely to be experienced by girls. So it happened in spaces that were theirs. The actions were not labelled or condemned by adults or those in authority as violence. So often this might happen in the playground. And interestingly, when it happened between boys, it would reflect the real violence model. Because it was two boys fighting in the playground, someone would get injured, the dinner ladies or the teachers would come up and tell them to stop doing it, and they'd be given a detention. So that same model is followed. When it happened to girls, it wasn't. It would be more likely to be done in private, where someone couldn't see. It would have the girl as a victim and the boy as a perpetrator. And when or if the girl told a teacher, she was told, oh, it doesn't matter. He's doing it because he likes you. Oh, don't make a fuss. So that lack of validation by girls from teachers succeeded in normalising their experiences and invalidating the experiences that they had. I mean, he's always doing it, and I tell the teacher and she thinks I'm telling tales, but it hurts. It really hurts me. He gives me Chinese burns. I don't like it. It's really sore. When I tell my mum, she says he does it because he likes me. I just wish he'd stop. He never gets told off, so he just keeps on doing it. Like boys always say to the teacher, it's a kid on, but they're doing it for real. So girls at this age, 11 and 12, are having their experiences invalidated. Growing up, teenagers, young women, this is replicated throughout the rest of their lives. So this is what feminists, in particular Kitzinger and Kelly, talk about in terms of the normalization thesis. The visibility of men's violence affecting society's understanding of its prevalence. So in the 70s, men's violence against women was hidden. It was a hidden phenomenon. It wasn't talked about. It wasn't dealt with by the police. But now there's an argument that the high prevalence of it succeeds in normalising rather than problematising it. So we've got organisations such as Everyday Sexism, Holler Back, which is to challenge women's harassment, street harassment. So trying to look at ways of problematising a normal phenomenon. So the examples given by the girls were seen as normal interactions between boys and girls, and often used as a basis for the old adage, he pulled your pigtails, so he must like you. He won't let you leave the house because he loves you. He's doing that because he's jealous, because he doesn't want you to leave him. So you can see how that progresses. It's because he loves you that he's treating you in that way. So one of the things I wanted to think about when I was doing this research was how violence was theorised spatially. And Jill Valentine used this concept here, how different identities and different spaces rub up against each other. So she used this when she was theorising about deaf, the big D deaf community. But I think you can use this when we're looking at violence against women and we're looking at the different spaces where the violence happens. So I think this is a useful analogy to draw attention to how we frame certain behaviours or actions depending upon where they happen and who they happen to. So a perfect example of this is the stranger danger. Your stranger rape and your date rape. Okay, so how they're seen on a dichotomous scale because of where it happens and who's perpetrating that violence. Looking at the girlfriend beaten at home or the woman punched by a stranger on the train. The teenage boys in the playground texting slag to a girl in their class, and the men leaning out of a car leering at a woman. So the different places and different spaces where this can happen and how we judge those spaces differently because of how we understand the public and the private. And I think this was what was happening to a lot of the young girls and continues to happen to a lot of young women. I also want to look at the spatial positioning when we're looking at siblings. A lot of people find this quite hard to deal with when I do talks on this, because people in the audience say, but that's what I did to my brother. That's how I treated my sister, because it's so normalised. Okay, so if we think about the 70s, that's how you treat your wife. You know, you're in charge, you're in control, but it's that same way, but he's the big brother. He's meant to boss his little brother about. He's meant to hold his arm behind his back until it breaks. He's meant to jump on him and cover him in cushions and smother him until he thinks he's going to choke. So it was really interesting the way the young people normalised a lot of their interactions with siblings, which actually were very physical, talking about black eyes, they were talking about broken arms, and how it was judged by parents and by themselves as just one of those things. And I know there's a woman in Bristol who's just done her PhD on this, so she hasn't actually published off it yet, but I think it'd be really interesting to see her findings on this as well. I also think as a mother or a father, if you've got any children, you start to think, oh my God, what do my kids do to each other as well? So just to put us in the frame there as well. So young people used this experiential knowledge to make sense of their lives. They looked at what was happening to them, what was happening to their peers and their friends, and understood their lives in this context. Girls often found that their own experiences of violent peers was invalidated by this lack of adult recognition and definition of the actions. So something as simple as a teacher saying, it's wrong, he shouldn't do that. This leads to the minimisation of such actions and an acceptance that it formed part of their everyday lives. And this is endorsed by Emma Reynolds, who found that the girls she asked about this daily experience of sexual harassment concluded, we're used to it. So again, this normalisation of this kind of behaviour. A lot of what the young people said, in particular the girls, replicated Liz Kelly's work, which incorporated these temporal and spatial characteristics of men's violence, in that the violence may occur over time. It may be located in the past, or it may impinge on the present and future lives. And what she says, and I think this is really important, is that the experience and or the naming of violence is not always an immediate or a present one. There's a reflection there. There's a conscious raising there that comes through it. So rather it can be experienced by the woman or the girl at that time or later as a threat, an invasion or an assault. And this is one of the things that when I've done the work with teachers, I've tried to get them to recognise how their behaviour, about how their instruction affects and informs how young people understand their experiences. So showing some of these quotes to a room full of head teachers gets some gasps, lots of horrified gasps, but also a recognition, because often it's about quashing the boys' riotous behaviour and thinking, oh, it's fine, just go and sit down. So it's about these constructions of masculinity and femininity that we have in the classroom and how the teacher deals with those. And often it's the immediate, I need to keep these boys quiet, I need to separate them, they're fighting physically, I don't want to deal with this over here. And so some of the ways that we've been working is to try and challenge that behaviour and to try and get teachers to recognise how their input is really important. So another of the findings is looking at violence as justified using understandings of gender. So you sometimes hit a girl if you get annoyed, if they say something to you. So you hit a girl if they say something that annoys you. Yeah. Sometimes you can hit hard and sometimes you can hit not very hard. Right, so you're saying it's okay to hit a girl if the girl... No, it's not okay to hit a girl, but it's okay if they annoy you. So if you have a reason, yeah. So these ways of justifying violence were very much contextualised by how young people understood heterosexuality and the institution of marriage. The institution of marriage was stronger in the Catholic school, but still very strong in the rest of the schools. It was something that was expected, it was something that you did. Even though half of their parents weren't married. So I find that really interesting, how they still had this idea of when I'm older I'll get married. There was also these accepted frameworks of men's dominance, looking in terms of the themes of obedience, ownership and possession, and entitlement. So that's how a lot of young people understood relationships between boys and girls and between men and women. The construction of the deserving and undeserving victim, including blaming women. So we only need to look at the papers to see where they're getting that from. And how young people understand and experienced their own gender inequalities. So heterosexuality was framed very much as natural. It's what you did, it's what was expected. So if you were a girl, you had a boyfriend, and if you were a boy, you had a girlfriend. You would get married, and that was the accepted way of being an adult. So heterosexuality was not considered an ideal, rather it was seen as normal and natural. And there were very few notable exceptions. One boy who talked about non-monogamous relationships and gay relationships. So the young people invested in very idealised discourses of marriage and children in that order. And often it was the maintenance of these frameworks that was important rather than the autonomy within that framework. Like if you have a boyfriend now and he does something wrong, you just dump him. But when you're married, it's different. You have to forgive him. Like if he hits you and then says sorry, you forgive him because you've been together longer and you're married, so it means more. If they live together and they're not married, she should just leave. I mean, if they're married, then she should have tried harder not to make him mad. She should be with him and make it work. So the importance of this union. Because they're a couple, she should do what he says. Well, she's been cheating on him, so she deserves it. Yes, she deserves it. But like, what he should have done, what he should do next time is not slap her, but say, next time dinner should be ready. I'm giving you your last warning, because slapping her just makes things worse. It might upset him if she doesn't do what he asks. So some of the young people saw the violence as wrong, but they didn't see the reasons behind the violence as wrong. So he actually should still get his tea, he just needs to approach it in a different way. Both of them should say that they're sorry, because she didn't ask to go out. She went out without his permission and he slapped her. She should have told him. She should at least contact him when she goes somewhere. He might be worried when she doesn't get back in time because his dinner wasn't ready. But as long as Claire keeps saying to Lee that she doesn't care, she's going out with him, it doesn't matter what they think, then maybe he would feel a bit more reassured about it and he would let her wear the top. He thinks he's protecting her. Because he'd be like, she's mine and she's wearing my ring and she's like my wife and this is what I married because she's beautiful. But she's only been seeing him for 4 months. It's not like she's technically his. He shouldn't have hit her. That's so wrong. what he should do is push her and say, next time, I want my dinner ready. This notion of a ring was very important. It was the ring that meant you belonged to somebody else. Very much the Beyonce song that went through my head over and over and over again. If you like it, you better put a ring on it. So this was the manifestation of that belief. I just want to remind you, before I show you the next slide, that these are 11 and 12-year-olds. So this is Claire and Lee. She's flaunting herself in front of other people. She could be enjoying that lots of boys are looking at her. She's revealing herself to the boys. She wants to wear the pink top to expose herself to them. She's got slutty clothes. So this very much is blaming Claire for Lee's reaction, and very much sexualising the female body, limiting Claire's choices with the moral and sexual responsibilities and the restrictive codes that should be attributed to her body. So these responsibilities that Claire has include modestly covering her body with more clothing and being aware of the reaction that her clothed body may incite. So everybody very much located the issue with Claire. And when I did this again and again and again and again, I was really shocked by this, because this wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting she can wear what she wants. It's her favourite clothes. What does it matter what he thinks? So after the first couple of groups, I decided to do something. So Claire and Lee have been seeing each other for 4 months. Lee's favourite top is his jeans and his vest top. Claire has asked Lee not to wear the vest top because she says other girls look at him and she doesn't like this. So we'd just done the first vignette and those were the responses that we got. I turned it on its head and this is what we got. I like this bit, so it's getting crosser and crosser with each one that I did there. Yeah, I mean, that kind of speaks for itself, really. The only positive thing that's really come out of this particular vignette is it's really helpful to be able to use in training, and it's really helpful to be able to show teachers, show youth workers, because it highlights that gendered analysis. So people that question that gendered analysis, when you show them this disparity, I think it just gives that clarification that it's hard to try and explain sometimes. So I think it's important to really place gender at the centre when we're looking at violence, and not just violence against women, but violence between men. So Jeff Hearn talks about all violence as being gendered, whether it's violence that's experienced, perpetrated, or witnessed. And we live in a society where the dominant social construction of masculinity awards aggression. And that came up time and time again with the young boys. They felt quite disabled by this idea and this ideal that there was just one way to be a man. And that's not the kind of man I want to be, but they felt like they had very few options of being a man in any other way. So it was about aggression, it was about violence, it was about power, because that's how they'd seen men be. And femininity constructed as passive, fearful, and dependence. And I think it's really important when we look at this gender analysis, because then we can understand the context, the motivations, and the impact of the violence. So work that I quoted initially, such as the NSPCC research, such as Marianne Hester's research, work by Christine Barter, looks at the impact of violence. So even though you might get young people of this age and older who, when you look at the graphs, looks like they're experiencing similar levels of violence, when you bring the impact into that, you can see that that's disproportionately affecting girls. So, violence against women, the definition that we use in Scotland, reflects an imbalance of power between men and women and also of more general gender inequalities. Such abuse cannot be eradicated until there is an equal balance between men and women in society and in relationships. You might have noticed that we've got a woman in charge of the country at the moment who is very, she promotes in terms of the gender balance of the cabinet, in terms of violence against women work. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, in terms of the cabinet. I love the quote that she gave when she introduced the cabinet of an equal number of men and women, and she got a number of emails asking if the women were there on merit or because of gender, but she didn't get a single email asking why the men were there. So I think to kind of bring it back, I think it's important to link it back to that Scottish context, because I find this a really useful framework to work with, and also it's one that's promoted, and I think I've been very lucky that my research has been taken on board and fitted in to what the Parliament and what Scotland are ultimately looking to change. I've got a few slides just to look at in terms of training and working with boys and girls. And I think this is quite important, because some of the groups I worked with were all boys, some were all girls, and some were mixed. And there's lots of arguments for sex education to be single sex. And that's something that I don't necessarily agree with, because I think it's important for boys and girls to be challenged and understand the experiences of other people. If this was a training session, out of the 5 boys here, there are 4 that argue against the case, but we've got the one hegemonic male that changes everyone's mind towards the end. And I think that's something, especially in youth work, that we need to look at, that powerful, singular male voice that can change everyone else's opinion. And the same with the girls as well. I think a lot of the girls wanted to be defiant and chose to be defiant and wanted to wear that vest top, but they were also worried about offending. They were also worried about damaging a relationship, about hurting people's feelings because of the way that we prioritise certain feminine attributes over and above others. So starting off very defiant and then very much modifying or appeasing the behaviour. But in a nice way, as in I'm going to the shops. Is that okay? And all that happens here is that girls turn into women who start to believe that it is their fault that the relationship isn't working. It is their fault that there's control, that aspects of coercive control are occurring, and looking to blame themselves rather than the perpetrators. This is to just highlight what I was talking about in terms of girls having very narrow aspirations. They were very much aged 10, 11, wanted to be astronauts, wanted to be teachers, wanted to be university lecturers for some reason, wanted to be dancers, brain surgeons. I can be anything I want to be. That's the way that they came across. I can do whatever I want. Me and my friends made up this rule: if we argue and we both fancy the same boy, we say friends are forever, boys are for whenever. And it's true. It's better to have your friends than a boyfriend. But when I'm older, like when I'm married, I'll probably just have one friend, and it'll be a woman. So at the moment, Sarah wanted to be a dancer or a doctor, and when she grows up, she'll have 2 babies and work part-time in the shop down the road. which is fine, but it's this narrowing of the aspirations, the narrowing of once I get married, once I have children, then everything will change. Not one boy picked that out. They wanted to be messy. Now they still wanted to be messy when they were 30. Okay, so there was no difference in how they saw their lives as changing, but girls were already acknowledging that their lives would be limited, that their aspirations would be narrowed. So one of the things that I took from this research, and Pam and I were talking about the wonders of public engagement and impact, so I thought I better add that on when I went back. So rather than looking at violence and working in schools and challenging and preventing violence in that way, I wanted to take it back a level and look at gender equality and to challenge teachers and to question who asks for two strong boys to move that table. Every single hand goes up. You know, so who gives boys and girls different activities to do in the classroom? But that's because they're interested in different things. No, it's not. So there's still this division that's happening within the education system, some of it more obvious, some of it more hidden, and part of that hidden curriculum. But some schools still lining boys and girls up separately, still telling boys and girls that they're different. So still encouraging boys and girls to have different interests, stopping the boy dressing up as Snow White, maybe encouraging the girl to play netball rather than football. So it's about challenging teachers' perceptions and about getting them to think about a lot of their unconscious decisions that they might be making, so boys and girls can look at the futures and their lives now as being more open. I can send this to Pam actually because I thought about this. Zero Tolerance, which is a great organisation in Edinburgh that does work, they did the black and white prevention pictures in the 1990s that looked at positive images of women rather than the two black eyes and the woman cowering in the corner. They started this promotion of positive and not blaming men's violence on power. So they've worked with YWCA Scotland and also YouthLink Scotland on the basis of this research, and they've got a booklet called Under Pressure, and they run training programmes for working with youth organisations and challenging gendered violence and gender inequality. It's also this research has also been mentioned in the Scottish Parliament quite a few times in terms of MSPs, so that's a member of the Scottish Parliament, wanting to promote prevention strategies in Scotland. So they've used this research as the basis for that. And I've got a few publications at the end, but I think people are quite interested to hear and then to try and find out ways, because I think that's one thing that I've managed to do over the past couple of years. You can present the findings and everyone can be horrified, but it's about turning those findings into something useful and something slightly more positive. So if anyone wants to look at any of those, just give me a shout.